Hello, and welcome to this joint webinar series hosted by the Milken Institute and Inquire AI. My name is Anastasia Trifanoff, and I'm Head of Customer Success at Inquire AI. We have a provocative discussion ahead around the future of work in life sciences. When setting the agenda for today's panel, we used Inquire AI's Pulse platform to gather insights from our global network of experts in and around the life sciences on the future of work in this industry. At Inquire AI, we provide smarter business intelligence through our AI-powered platform, allowing you to crowdsource answers to your questions from subject matter experts around the globe in real time. If you'd like to book a demo of our Pulse platform, you can do so at inquire.ai. Let's welcome our moderator today, Terry Mcbride. Terry is an advisor with Inquire AI, and she'll be introducing our speakers from Invest Puerto Rico and Maryland Tech Council. Over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Anastasia. I'm delighted to be here. So as was just mentioned, we are joined by two tremendous experts. We're joined by Roderick Miller, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Invest Puerto Rico, and also Martin Rosendale, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Maryland Tech Council. Martin, if you could give a little bit of your background, that would be tremendous.
Sure, Terry, thank you. And first, I'd like to thank Inquire AI and the Milken Institute for this opportunity to speak to everybody today. So, as Terry said, I am the CEO of the Maryland Tech Council. The Maryland Tech Council is the industry trade association in the state of Maryland in the U.S. that supports all of the life science and technology companies throughout the state. Fundamentally, our mission is to help our members succeed. So we do that with respect to advocacy and helping them make connections with investors, with potential partners, and other aspects of what we do. My personal background, by training, I'm an engineer and a microbiologist. I've been a biotechnology executive for about 35 years now. I've been the CEO of 6 organizations, if you count the Maryland Tech Council. 3 of those organizations have been biotech companies, and 2 of the companies were companies that I founded.
Great, thank you very much. Roderick, if you could share some of your background as well, please.
I'm so excited to be here, and it's really nice, as Marty also mentioned, to be invited to this conversation through Inquire and the Milken Institute. My name is Rod Miller. I'm the CEO of Invest Puerto Rico. Invest Puerto Rico is the island's economic development agency. We were established by law about 5 years ago, specifically with the objective of bringing new jobs and capital investment to the island. We do that through 4 channels. One is through business development. So how do we create relationships with C-suite executives and those that advise them to help them move to the market? Through marketing efforts, really shifting the story of Puerto Rico from crisis to resilience and opportunity. We do that through strategy and research, and we also do that through strategy and research and competitiveness issues. And we also do it through working with stakeholders and partners. I've got about a 20-year background in economic development. Prior to leading Invest Puerto Rico, I led the recovery efforts in the city of New Orleans, as well as Detroit. I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you very much. I feel like this is an easy question considering the expertise of the panelists. But when we think about biotech and what are some of the innovations that are going to drive economic growth, what are some of those that come top of mind?
Rod, do you want to take that one, or you want me to start?
Sure, I can start off. I mean, I think one of the big things is, of course, the gene and cell therapy space. That has to be kind of at the top of the list, and that's probably the most exciting because we recognize the long-term health implications if that business model is able to work itself out in terms of the ability to be able to scale and viability. So if they can bring that cost in line and actually start to scale, I think that's going to be vital for that space. I think some of the big public policy issues, though, are also going to be driving the space moving forward. I mean, what we saw with COVID and the lack of access to PPE for American citizens, there's going to be a lot of public policy pressures to drive investment and stuff in certain places. So I also think that's going to be a big driver. But I'll stop with that. I could go on.
So, and I'll add to that. So I also agree. So cell and gene therapy is a big area for innovation and growth. In Maryland, we have the privilege of being in the location where the human genome was originally sequenced in the U.S. I should point out, where the work between the National Institutes of Health and in the private industry sector came together to sequence the human genome. And so cell and gene therapy, to some extent, got started here. What we're seeing, though, is a fascinating evolution. As these development companies are becoming commercial, we're seeing tremendous growth in biomanufacturing, cell manufacturing, gene therapy manufacturing. And so we're seeing a lot of opportunity, a lot of growth there, which has also changed the nature of the workforce that we need. But in addition to that, as new companies are being formed, we're seeing a lot of incorporation of digital technologies. Artificial intelligence is being incorporated into these technologies. And in the future, we're going to see quantum computing being incorporated. Quantum computing has the promise of dramatically reducing the development time for some of these therapeutics by doing complex modeling and other aspects of the development process. So there's a lot of innovation going on right now. We're seeing innovation in manufacturing, protein manufacturing, to improve efficiencies and outputs. I know in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of manufacturing in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. I'm sure that Rod is seeing a lot of development in that space as well.
Great, thank you very much. It was interesting when we ran the network pulse question on this. What are some of the innovations that might come up? We got very interesting and wide-ranging answers. And some of them included the use, for example, vaccines, of course, aging, CRISPR, personalized medicine. But Rod, I want to go back to something you said about some of the barriers to scale, because we have so many tremendous innovations. I would love to hear more about what do you see as some of the obstacles to scaling? And then Marty, if from your experience, if you can also talk about some of those things that we can do to counteract those obstacles.
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of the obstacles to scaling, I think first and foremost is that the space is crowded with a lot of unknowns right now, specifically, you know, in some of the spaces that you mentioned. So we've got a space now where there's incredible growth and everyone sees where the market's going. And that also means that there's more noise in the marketplace. We always know that at this phase of development of any industry, there's going to be a lot of people that make a lot of money and there are going to be a lot of people that lose a lot of money. And I think that risk is very real and is oftentimes lost in these discussions. And I think some of the best ways to do that, of course, are making markets more competitive. And of course, so that's all about talent. Do you have the right talent? Talent is practically, realistically everything. I think, and so that talent question is really going to drive where that investment goes. And the markets that are able to quickly amplify the capacity of their regions to kind of, you know, provide that talent are the ones that are going to win. And that's going to really mean, you know, tapping into some different resources for the talent. And then the last point I guess I'll mention in terms of some of the barriers to scaling would be just the issue of spaces. Facilities matter, and these are not inexpensive facilities, and many of these companies would struggle to pay for these facilities if they did not have some sort of government subsidy. And so we've got certified landing pads, for example, in Puerto Rico, such as Ocean Bio out on the West Coast and the Molecular Science Research Center and other spaces, so that we can take some of those risks away. But I think, you know, talent, capital, spaces. And then the last thing I would say is government has to be a partner. Government has to get in the game, or the investment is going to go elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Marty, what's your response to that? And I would like to hold on the question of talent, because I think we could have a very long discussion just about this, and we'll come back to that question.
Yeah, definitely we'll come back to that. So I'm going to start where Roderick ended up, which is government, because another aspect or another barrier to this growth is the regulatory barrier. It was interesting. One of the things that we saw with COVID-19 and the development of the vaccines, mRNA vaccines can be developed very quickly, and they can be adapted and modified very quickly as a virus itself evolves over time. But the regulatory authorities' ability to keep up with that speed is a challenge. And so part of what we need to do is work with our regulatory authorities around the world to help them, first of all, understand that technology is going to increase the speed of development in biotechnology and in life sciences, and they're going to need to keep up with that speed. If you look at the technology industries, and I have the perspective of seeing both technology and life science industries. Technology industries move at a very fast pace. Life sciences and pharmaceutical industries are not accustomed to that pace, but we're getting there, and that pace is getting ever faster. And so the regulatory authorities need to figure out how they're going to keep up with that pace going forward. Is it possible, for instance, to continue to approve therapeutics and pharmaceuticals at the pace that they approved the COVID-19 vaccines? I doubt that it's possible to continue at that pace on a regular basis, but how quickly can we improve that? and then with respect to capital, I think there's a number of things that we can do. First of all, there's a lot of communication that needs to go on with respect to what is happening in the industry. Let's help investors understand the value and the potential here. Rod also made the point about government investment. Government investment is critical, especially in the early stages, because that government investment can build the credibility of a company as they're developing and make them more of greater interest to investors going forward. So the government support in the early stages through tax credits, through direct investment, through other mechanisms can be very supportive of future investment and private and venture and institutional investment going forward.
Great. Thank you for that. Rod, what is your response to that?
Yeah, I agree, but I'd really like to hunker on this question of government for just a second. The best thing that government can do is do what government is supposed to do well. And so that idea that there are some services, whether it's related to permitting, whether it's related to decrees, whether it's related to the process of businesses getting set up, where government oftentimes has hurdles that ultimately translate into more costs for companies. And so I think the more government can be efficient in providing those basic services well, that's vitally important. The other point, and as you talk about government really sharing in the responsibilities, I think government has an opportunity to define a North Star for industry, work with industry to define a North Star and actually build their competencies, capacities, regulations, and competitiveness around that. And so you find that the governments that win, the markets that win, their governments are very intentional about what types, the profile of the companies that they want in their market and what they want to see happen. And they create that environment. And so that's a very intentional thing, which is the opposite of what governments do in many cases.
Great, thank you. Marty, I want to come back to a comment you made about the speed of regulatory review or approval. How do we balance innovation, speed, and either public health or perceived trust in public health? Because sometimes it seems that those are all working against each other.
Absolutely, and I'm not suggesting it's easy. I think there's a number of things that we can do. First of all, there's a communication challenge, right? In communicating with the public to drive that public trust that we need. We saw that with the COVID-19 vaccines. That came out in a large way because of the rapid development of those vaccines. And I think to some extent a misunderstanding by the majority of the public about whether that rapid development would involve shortcuts and other things that would have compromised safety. So there's a communication piece to this, but there's also, I call it the attitude of the government. The government can be a barrier or they can be an accelerator, and we need them to be an accelerator. So we need them to start considering, instead of always demanding the gold standard of a clinical trial. For instance, when a product is close to commercialization and they're collecting data, start considering collecting real world data. We have data analytic tools now that would allow us to be collecting data in the real world clinical environment, so that we don't have to always rely on randomized, controlled, blinded clinical trials, and we could get these products out, get them in use, and continue to collect this real world data and use those analytics to rely on making future decisions about those products. And this could get us into a conversation around precision personalized healthcare and some other things. But I really believe that there's an opportunity here for government to become an accelerator of development versus a barrier.
Thank you. Rod, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, this is the time, and I always drive this question back to one of competitiveness and what makes markets competitive. And I think the reality is when we look at some of the investments globally by like many members that are on the line, their markets, what government is doing to innovate in terms of investment, accelerating investment and opportunity in these spaces is far beyond what the US is doing. I think we're at a very unique moment right now in the US with all of the federal dollars that are coming down through Build Back Better, through ARPA, et cetera, for local communities and regions to really think about what are those strategic investments that they need to make to better position themselves and kind of, and one of the powerful things that government also has, the question always goes to incentives, but I would put incentives not at the back of the line, but it's definitely not at the front. One of the powerful things that governments have is not just the spaces and places, but the procurement capacity. And what we're seeing is that a lot of companies are willing to test our market or think about our market differently based on what kind of procurement opportunities there are in our market to do business with our government. And I think governments have to think about their spending power that way as an additional lever in attracting investment.
Terry, if I could for just a second, come back to you mentioned the balance. I do think that government plays a very important role in regulating the industry, and there is a balance between regulation and speed. And I'll use gene editing as an example here. We're at a point in gene editing where we can modify plants, we can modify animals, we can modify the human body. That can be wonderful, and it can be very dangerous. And so, the government plays an important role here, and we need to strike a balance between that regulatory role and the speed of development of these products.
And it's interesting because one of the comments you made was the use of real world data. And I have to say, from my perspective, that also raises concerns about data privacy. So on one hand, it's great that we're going down the route of personalized medicine. It's great that we're getting to such an individualized level. On the other hand, who has the right to own our data? And how do we make sure that we keep control of that?
Is that for me?
It's for both of you.
So I'll start. We spend a lot of time with our legislature talking about this topic because it's very important. Everybody should own their own data and wants to keep it private. I think we're living in an era, though, where privacy, to some extent, it doesn't exist. I mean, just think about, the measures and the lengths that you have to go through to keep your identity from being stolen, because your information is on the dark web somewhere. Somebody that you don't want to have your private information has your private information. And so to some extent, we have to accept that privacy is going to be a challenge. And where we really need to focus is on security to make sure that people can't do anything with that data once they get it. So the difference between privacy and security, I think focusing on security is a critical component to this. There's a big debate about who should own the data, the person collecting it or the person that it's being collected from. I personally believe that we should own our own data. I would like to think that as individuals, we would be willing to share that data to help the greater good. But I do think we need to find ways to allow individuals to own their own data.
Great, thank you. Rod?
Yeah, it's an interesting, I too believe that people should own their own data. I think it's an interesting challenge though, because I do believe in, that privacy in the way that we've traditionally thought about it really just doesn't exist anymore. I do think though that that part of the challenge, when we're looking at government spending and other things is and the question of who owns the data is who has the bill, right? When you start looking at the implications on healthcare and other things, there's an argument to be made that while individuals should own their own data, because the government has to subsidize healthcare and a variety of other areas, that there is a strong case that the government should have a higher level of access. I've heard that argument made, and I think it's a credible one to some extent. The reality is politically, I don't think that would ever fly. But realistically, that level of access to data would accelerate R&D across and investment by quite a bit.
made an interesting comment earlier that some people are going to be, and I'll paraphrase, absolute winners, and some people are going to be absolute losers in this new landscape. Who do you see as being the absolute losers in this?
Well, I think historically, when we look at things historically, people of color in the United States have, and poor people around the world have historically been the losers. Why? Because there's lesser access to the technologies as they're being developed, unless it's, unless it's in an experimental phase that may not be safe. Historically, that's just been what's happened. So I think, people of color and poor communities tend to lose in this battle. And I think, and when I say this battle, I'm talking about this economic battle. I think the opportunities for other communities, low and moderate income communities around the world to compete is going to be vital for the long-term sustainability and competitiveness of everybody. We know that talent is the most important driver of investment decisions and innovation. And we also know that the developing world has lots of talent that isn't totally able to participate. And so I think the more that we can pull communities of color into these conversations, and low and moderate income countries around the world, the more competitive we'll all be.
Great, thank you. And I will say this was a discussion that we had even earlier of how do we get more talent into the industries, particularly underserved communities, underserved populations. So, and I've also voiced my frustration to both of you that I feel like this question, it's the exact same question we could have been asking 25 years ago. So what can we actively do now? And what's the gap? What are we not doing, perhaps at a systemic level, that is hindering our progress?
You want to start? You want me to start? Either way.
I'm happy to go, Rod.
Go ahead.
So there's a lot of things. This is a big topic in itself. I think, historically, being more inclusive, more equitable has been a moral imperative, certainly in the US and I think around the world. Today, it's an economic imperative, and it's an economic imperative for a number of reasons. We're seeing workforce challenges. We need to expand the workforce. And in order to do that, we're going to have to reach into communities that have historically been disconnected communities. And so it's an economic perspective from that point of view. But also from the point of view, and one of the things that we've looked at the Maryland Tech Council is the challenge of equitable access to technology and what that does in these communities. One of the things that we saw certainly in the US with the pandemic and the fact that we all had to quarantine for such a long period of time is that we moved very rapidly to a cashless society. And we were moving in that direction already, but we moved very rapidly. And the realization, at least for me and some of my board members, was if we don't resolve some of the issues in these disconnected communities, they're going to be excluded from the economy. And so it becomes an economic imperative both for the communities as well as for industry. So that creates a new dynamic. Now we've got reasons for these communities to come together with industry, resolve these problems, build the workforce, get this talent where it needs to be. And I think part of the problem in the past, and I've had a number of conversations with organizations that have been working on this challenge for decades. Part of the problem in the past has been the shotgun approach. The kind of attitude if we just go out there and educate people and talk about it, then we'll solve the problem. People will pay attention, they'll get interested, and it will happen. I think there's an opportunity here to be much more intentional and focused, and to go into these disconnected communities and find pockets and groups of people that are interested in these positions and interested in these opportunities, and help them make the connections that they need to get the training, to get the experience, to know the right people, so that they can move into these industries. It's interesting. I recently had the opportunity to talk with the author of a book called "The Future Economy and Inclusive Competitiveness," Jonathan Hollyfield. A great book that I would recommend to anybody. And he makes the point that in these disconnected communities, the innovation economy is invisible. They don't even see it. And so if we can take a very targeted, intentional approach and make the innovation economy more apparent, I think that we can resolve some of the equity and inclusivity challenges that we have.
Okay, Thank you for that. I have so many questions, but before I ask my questions, Rod, what's your response to this?
Yeah, I would build on what Marty said, and I'd build on it in a couple of ways. One is I think, part of the challenge historically has been that it's been a moral imperative and not necessarily, and there hasn't been recognition of the economic one. And so what that does is that the approach to driving economic growth and opportunities in these markets tends to be a social service one. And a social service approach will not work. It comes from a place where people are viewed as deficits versus being viewed as assets. And that kind of approach doesn't really engage a population to fully engage. And so I think a big piece of what has to happen, and I think, the workforce development piece is first and foremost, but it's really about integration of these communities throughout the value chain of the business. So what does it look like to have businesses and entrepreneurship opportunities out of these communities, out of investors that may be from those communities, out of a workforce or senior executives in those spaces? How do you create those kind of entrepreneurship opportunities? What does it look like to have those businesses actually in those communities so that there's exposure and kind of a much more applied approach and understanding of kind of the impacts? That kind of integration beyond, I think, the workforce development is a critical component to long-term wealth. And I think it creates a different sort of relationship than what's been in the past.
I think you make a really interesting distinction about populations being, let's say, deficits versus assets. And I do think in other instances, it has come at from a different perspective. It was interesting when we posed this question to the Network Pulse, we got back some responses like we should have quotas, or we should have sponsored student places for people who are going to enter the realm of biotech. What are some of the more provocative things we can do? Because of course, we can educate, we can take a more targeted approach, we can build in those local communities. And I'll go back to, it seems like we've been talking about this for decades. But if we were going to do just one incredibly innovative thing and wave your magic wand, you have all the power in the world. What is that one thing that each of you would do?
That's a great question. I'll start. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier this idea of development, and what we know is that there's not enough spaces and places to support the industry. And so I think if there were a magic wand as it relates to these communities, it would be trying to figure out how to create development capacity to drive the industry in those communities. And by development capacity, I mean real estate development capacity, entrepreneurship capacity, as well as workforce development capacity. And with those things, and capital. And with those things, now you've got the actual ability to actually kickstart economies and reposition some of these lesser performing markets.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to take a little bit different approach. If I had that magic wand, and I really don't know how to do this, but I've thought about it a lot, is create experience. I think that is a part of the challenge. I look at my grandkids. So I have one daughter and I have two grandkids. When my daughter was young, my wife and I were fairly young and not as worldly as I think we are today. And so she didn't experience as many things as I would have liked her to. She was growing up. And so when she had to make life decisions, there were experiences that I think she didn't have. With my grandchildren, I'm older, I've been around more, and it's my mission to make sure they experience everything that they can, because I want them to have all the information they need to make those life decisions. If I could take that into these communities and give them that experience, I mean, some organizations are out there with the attitude, we want to expose everybody to STEM. We want everybody to become a scientist or a technician, or, and that's great. But the talent in these communities includes artists, and it includes entrepreneurs, it includes, a lot of different forms of talent. And so again, if I had that magic wand, it would be focused on how do we get the young population the experience that they need to make the best life decisions for themselves going forward.
That's interesting. I'm noticing even when we talk, we are talking about these communities, and it's almost as if we are othering them and creating even more distance between us and those people. So even at the most basic level, how do we close that gap so it is not us reaching out to those noble people who just need a chance in those communities? Like, how do we close the gap at the most fundamental level?
That's a
I think
really good
most-
question.
yeah,
Go ahead, Rod, please.
I think at the most fundamental level, it's very simple. It's engagement. It's, the idea of not going into communities and saying we have all the answers, but actually having a dialogue and really understanding from members of the community what their challenges are, what they see as their opportunities, and allowing for some sort of participation in the process. I think that goes a long way in restoring bridges, but I also think it goes a long ways in terms of establishing the kind of trust where folks are more apt to believe versus when solutions are. Oftentimes the solutions for those communities are throw a lot of money at a problem, or say here's the answer, and not really have a dialogue or discussion. And I think that's an important place to start. And then I think the bigger place though, that where we really want to end up is at the end of the day, they're just part of the ecosystem. People in Black and brown communities in the US or low and moderate incomes, they're just part of the ecosystem, and they do what they do to actually help keep the economy going. When we get to the place where there's that level of integration and it's not even a cognizant, a conscious effort, that's when we know we've done what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Rod. A question that I ask a lot of people when I'm having this conversation is, what does it look like when we're successful? What does the world look like when we're done and this is successful? And I think, Terry, to your point, and I'm guilty, obviously, of referring to the disconnected communities and such. But I think part of it, is once we are truly inclusive, part of what it looks like is we're not talking about it anymore because we don't need to. And we are truly being inclusive, and we're finding ways for equity. Equity in accessibility to technology, equity in accessibility to opportunity. And when I think of the different communities, I have family that live in and around the Ozarks in the central US, in farming country. And the opportunities there to get into life sciences and biotechnology, I mean, as the world population grows, the need to be more efficient in the way we grow food, and the opportunity in life sciences and biotechnology to expand on that is huge. And so there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of ways to be more inclusive and more equitable. And I think the closer we get, the less we will be talking of, specifically about communities.
That's helpful. It's when I think about inclusivity, how do we make sure that we're inclusive even now? And we're creating access for talent pools for people who may not have advanced degrees or people who may not even have undergrad degrees. So what are some of those avenues to reach biotech industries when you don't have that base level of education?
Well, so that's a great question. And it's an area that the Maryland Tech Council, we're focused on pretty intently right now. I don't know if you can see the Biohub pin on my lapel here. We recently started an operation, a program called the Maryland Biohub. And the first stage of this Biohub is a workforce development opportunity and a way to solve some of the workforce challenges that we're seeing. And so, to answer your question, first of all, there was early in the days of biotechnology, we needed a lot of PhDs. And Maryland boasts having one of the highest number of employed PhDs in the country. But today, as these companies are commercializing, we don't need as many PhDs. We certainly don't want PhDs on the manufacturing line. And so there are opportunities for high school graduates, for people with associates, 2-year degrees, 4-year degrees. There are huge opportunities. And to some extent, we're referring to them as non-traditional students. When I'm talking with educators around the state, around the country, we talk about non-traditional students, and that more and more students are becoming non-traditional. By the current definition of a non-traditional student, I fit that model. My father is an entrepreneur. He taught me tool design when I was in high school. I used to follow him around his business. And I graduated high school as an engineer, started my first company that was an engineering company. But I used that skill set to put myself through college as a microbiologist. And I didn't finish college until I was married and had a child. That is the definition of a non-traditional student, somebody who goes back to school, somebody who wants to change careers, somebody who's not interested in going straight from high school to a PhD. And that's what we need in this space right now. We need biologists who are also engineers. We need financial managers who are also biologists. We need this mix of skills to build the industry. And when we're going to do that, I think through certificate programs, through opportunities for shorter bursts of education, if you will, to get people into these roles so they can learn more about what's happening. And then we have to build wraparound services around it. We have to make sure that the opportunities, that the equitable accessibility is there, that everybody can get to these opportunities, whether it's childcare because you didn't go back to college until your child was born, or whether it's transportation or other things that are needed for these non-traditional students to take advantage of these opportunities.
Great, thank you. So Rod, is it that we look to non-traditional students and they help fill the talent pool, or how else could we make sure that we're getting people who may not have that traditional education level, or even how do we expand it just on a gender basis to make sure more women are involved in the workforce?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in Puerto Rico, we've got the 6th largest concentration of STEM professionals, according to the World Economic Forum. And we graduate about 35,000 engineering and science STEM graduates every year. 6 out of 10 of them are women. So we've been able to actually tackle that, and I think a lot of it is just kind of the expectation. Puerto Rican mom and dad says you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be an engineer. It doesn't matter whether you're a boy or girl, and that's kind of it. But I think that I think there's been intentionality around making sure that there were clear on ramps, and I think a big piece of it, whether it's a non-traditional student or a traditional student or a traditional worker, is what are the on ramps, various types of on ramps for people at different phases of their lives that allow them not only wrap around services, but to start making income as quickly as possible. The more that you can shorten those training periods to get to real income producing, the better. And I would only add to that. We think about the talent war in a couple of different ways. I mean, development is only one side of the equation. We've been very aggressive, and other markets around the country and globe are doing it as well, being very focused on how do we actually attract talent? What's the type of talent that we need to actually build the capacity that we need in the space? And so we had targeted campaigns in places like Raleigh and Silicon Valley and others to say to the best talent from around the world, whether they've got a college degree or not, this is a place that welcomes you. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of talent poaching, especially as COVID has shown people that they can work almost from anywhere. And companies are finding, with the right kinds of support and giving their employees that flexibility, employees are more likely to remain loyal. So I think these talent wars, in terms of an intentional attraction of talent from other markets, is going to heat up a lot. And then the last point I'll make is this interdisciplinary piece is vitally important. We're finding that every company, it doesn't matter what sector it is, needs computer programmers, and that's doubly true in bioscience. So the idea that we've got to have folks trained in pharma, manufacturing, and bioscience, and computers, as well as data analytics. All of those things are being kind of required. That interdisciplinary approach is more important than ever.
And I'll add,
thank you.
if I could, we need to make sure that we get bias out of career counseling. And I think, whether you're a veteran that is looking for your next career, or whether you're a high school student looking for your career, this is a story that my wife tells, and of course, we're older, so it's a couple decades old, but when she was a senior in high school going through career counseling, and they put you through tests and whatnot, and they help you decide what you're going to be good at, she really wanted to be an archaeologist, but the testing said, she's a woman, she ought to be a nurse. And guess what? She became a nurse. And she still tells that story because she really wanted to be an archaeologist. And I think, we've got to make sure that that kind of bias is eliminated from all forms of career counseling.
Yeah, and I do think that bias plays into it. I do want to come back to a comment that was just made that many workers can work from anywhere. And I think we need to recognize that many knowledge workers can work from anywhere, because there are a number of people during the pandemic that those frontline workers, whether it is in healthcare, in grocery stores, in day-to-day transport services, they did not have the luxury of working from anywhere. So when we talked about some people are sheltering in place, there are other people who are going out every single day and facing that. So I think even in our language, making sure all of us are inclusive. One thing I do want to highlight just to the audience members of the webinar, please, if you have questions, feel free to put them into Q&A, and we'll try to address as many as possible. There have been a couple of questions that have come up that it's great to talk about getting talent in the door, but how do you keep talent? What role does culture play when you actually get talent into the door of a company?
I can start with that one. I believe culture plays a big role. Culture is about how you treat people and how you expect people to be treated within your company. And so if you're in a company and you feel like you're being treated fairly, if the company is being inclusive, if you feel like you matter, you're going to be more likely to want to stay in that company. And so I think culture is a big part of that. There's also the fundamentals. You need to make sure that your salaries keep up with the competition. You need to make sure that the benefits are there. So that you've got to have the fundamentals as a baseline. But beyond that baseline, I believe it really is all about culture and how people are treated within your company as far as retention.
Great, thank you.
And I think that's an intentional thing. Culture is something that's developed intentionally. And so I completely agree with Marty, but that effort to make a culture that's inclusive and creates opportunities, it's encompassing. It's not just, that you're treated nicely at work, but it's like when everybody else is invited out for a drink after work, is she invited or is he invited? Is there a professional development plan that allows the person to see a path and a future for themselves in the corporation? Is there acknowledgement? That maybe because of the different background, there are cultural differences, and is there because companies have cultures, there's almost a process of indoctrination. Is that an intentional process, or is that understood that this is what the culture of the organization is? I think those sorts of things kind of create clearer paths to development and growth and worker loyalty.
That's interesting. There has just been a question raised about millions of people can't find work. So it's less about getting people in the door, and yet we have a labor gap in other firms. So what do you think about online ways of connecting people internationally to close the gap in employment, to take this inefficiency out of the labor market, and working on a cross-international basis to match skilled workers? Is that something that we could even do, like domain-specific LinkedIn, or do you think people need to be in the local community for this to work?
I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm seeing a lot of that emerge right now. My team was recently at an event, and there was a large group of folks from Ukraine there, and it was a tech event, and they actually have a website for all of these dislocated workers from Ukraine, trying to figure out how they continue to participate in the labor market. And so we see that happening. In Puerto Rico, we've got a group called Comprometidos, which has a database of the Puerto Rican diaspora around the globe and trying to find ways to connect them to job and employment opportunities. I think this idea of fluid workforce is the future. And I think, with Web 3.0 and VR and some of the other things that we're seeing, I think it's going to increasingly be the future. I think the markets that figure out how to do it first or do it well are going to be the real winners. And I think we're quite a ways from being able to do it well yet. But that's definitely the direction we're headed in.
Yes, so I would agree. I see it developing as well, and I agree with the last statement you made, Rod, which is we're quite a ways from doing it as well as we could be. I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's still a significant amount of distrust of digital media, and the fact that you don't really know who you're talking to. They can put anything in that resume. They can put anything in that online survey. And so as we learn to better vet that and create the tools that help us make sure we can have the confidence that we know who we're talking to and who we're interacting with, I think that's going to help. I think some of the job boards and the job tools out there, they're good. They're okay. I think they also suffer from bias because they use a lot of algorithms in determining, you put your resume here, we're gonna use this algorithm and determine who your resume, where it shows up. And so that's an ongoing challenge that we also see in some of our government advocacy work, is how do we remove bias from decision-making algorithms? It's a big challenge, because if you think about it, computer programming in itself is intended to build in bias, right? It's if-then statements. If this happens, then this is going to happen. And it's difficult to take bias out of that. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. But like Rod said, I see it being used more and more effectively and efficiently. But there is a fair amount of work that needs to be done to make it even better.
That's interesting. I have to stop and say this feels like a very American-centric discussion. So if we take a very different lens, what can the US learn internationally from market leaders, either from the research side, innovation, commercial side? What is something that the US can be doing differently?
Well, I would follow Israel. I mean, I think Israel is a great place to start. When you look at the investments that they've made, how aggressive they've been in terms of building capacity across a variety of sectors. Their chief innovation officer, I believe, is the role. Their chief scientific officer has a variety of investment, has a complete investment portfolio and a variety of tools that we don't have in the U.S. And they've created a culture, a startup culture where, I went there and it was this great company, and I was asking the investor, are you going to invest in them? They seemed great. They said, no, this is only their first company. I'm waiting until they do their second or their third. And so I think, what the U.S. can do better. And this is not something, I mean, when you look at the history of the Jewish community, there's a reason why the idea of starting a business isn't that scary. And I think a lot of times in the developed world, there are so many kind of safeguards and other things that people have other options, and they feel like, oh, well, the risk of starting a business is too high. And I think in other markets, what we're seeing is that risk is a risk that's worth taking. People feel like they have partners in their government in making those investments, and there's an intentionality that I think that we often lack, kind of both at a national level and in many cases at a local level. I remember when Deval Patrick put forth that $1 billion back in 2007, 2008 to say, this is what Massachusetts is going to be. And of course, it helps to have Harvard and MIT amongst others. But at the end of the day, that kind of public investment and recognizing that, hey, entrepreneurship really needs support. I think the U.S. has a long way to go in terms of being competitive with some of the other international markets.
Okay, thank you. Marty, what would you add to that? Internationally, what could we be learning, or where are some of those hotspots?
Well, I think so risk is, and risk acceptance, risk tolerance is a big part of it. And that's a part of the country culture. And Rod mentions Israel. I had the opportunity to be the CEO of an Israeli company a number of years back, and I got a lot of stories to tell about the risk tolerance of Israeli entrepreneurs and the things that they can get done because of that. And so I think that's a part of driving innovation, and it's something that certainly we can learn from. But I think there's also this attitude of we're just going to get it done. We're going to be successful. And we're seeing that in China now. We're seeing that in other countries around the world. And I think, to some extent, we've lost a little bit of that in the US. I think we could bring some of that back, some of that culture of success and drive and entrepreneurialism. Some of that can be driven by the government and how the government supports entrepreneurs, but a lot of it just needs to be driven by the culture in general.
Thank you. It's interesting that you mentioned China. One of our audience members has raised the question, like talking about investment, considering that more than 90% of medical devices come from China. How do we balance making sure that we have innovation versus dependence on someone who may be starting to dominate the market internationally?
That's a really good question. And we're seeing that, we're seeing concerns about that in a number of forms. So the supply chain challenges that the world has experienced recently. And so there's a lot of conversations around should the US onshore more of our manufacturing to avoid those supply chain challenges in the first place. I recently was in a conversation with an economist from the University of Maryland on this topic, and her point of view was we shouldn't onshore everything, but we should strike a balance so that we've got diversity in our supply chain to manage that. I think that what we're going to see is, China's going to evolve. China started out as being a powerhouse in manufacturing, and they're becoming a powerhouse in innovation. And so we're going to see more and more products being developed in China than maybe we saw in the past. And so we're going to see some evolution and I think some balance around the world between innovation, manufacturing, and other aspects. Part of the problem, though, is the geopolitical environment, right? We're always going to have to deal with that. The relationships between the U.S. and China, the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, and how that's going to impact innovation around the world, supply chain challenges, and other things. And there's not going to be any way to get around the geopolitical challenges that we see.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. I mean, I think, you talk about China, and the other one, our market that's really interesting, of course, is India. And looking at both of those markets, I think like I mentioned earlier, COVID really started to push a lot of these companies to actually have to push for nearshoring because the governments of the US and other markets were saying, hey, we need these things close. What's driven historically the Chinese activity was low cost. And I think what we're finding is that cost is becoming less of an important equation in that, because it's actually a question now of security, both in terms of national security, in terms of personal security, and then you've also got the issue in terms of logistics kind of backlog and some of the stuff that's happening. So I think all of those things are going to force companies, particularly in those markets, to consider expansion. And as we did our analysis, what we found is that even a lot of the money, even though a lot of it's local, there's also a lot of US and European money in those markets. And I think we're going to see the reins tighten in terms of federal policy that might push some of that money back stateside.
That's interesting. I want to take a little bit of a step back to part of our earlier discussion and go back to investing in local communities. And there's been a really interesting question posed of, why do you think companies have been willing to donate large dollars to charities that are focused on quote unquote people of color issues like skills training, workshops, etc., but they're unwilling to commit to directly hiring, training, and promoting people of color?
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I guess I would need more specific examples to really understand where that question was coming from and to address it. Because I think what I'm seeing, certainly in the companies that I'm dealing with, is there is a greater interest in promoting, training, and elevating people of all races. And so I guess I'm not seeing that imbalance as much as you might have seen it in the past. I mean, what I think they're talking about is companies that are virtue signaling and not really being serious about what they need. But coming back to the point that I made earlier, that this has become an economic imperative. I think that it's making companies, it's forcing them to act on what they say they're going to do.
I would only add, I think it's a mix. I do think that there are companies out there that are, that are more apt to give money to big initiatives than to hire. And I think that the opposite's also true. But I think a lot of what's driving that behavior is that when companies don't seem to really be authentically interested, it's because they don't know how to access and how to communicate, how to engage communities. Because I will tell you, every single company I talk to has a workforce issue or a looming workforce issue. And so I do believe that by and large, companies want to figure out how to diversify their workforces. But I do think politically, the political climate, George Floyd, a variety of other things have created a scenario where companies have to be much louder about their efforts and intentions to do so. And I think in many cases, or in some cases, I don't say many, but in some cases, I do believe that companies make those investments and they say, well, this is something to put some points on the board and show that we're serious about it, but they may not have a real plan, a real strategy. I find that by and large, the answer when you don't know what to do is to throw some money and declare, hey, we're doing something.
Yes, unfortunately, I think that has been the case. I will offer that in some cases it comes back to, and we spoke about it earlier, biases. So confirmation bias, hiring bias, unconscious implicit bias. And even in the UK, there have been studies where the same CV has gone out and it's had one name versus another more ethnic sounding name. And one CV got a much higher response rate. So I do think there are still significant biases in the hiring system, absolutely. So one thing I wanted to touch on, recognizing that time is starting to draw to a close. We've talked about the fast moving industries, we've talked about the need to communicate, but how do we close that information gap when we're moving at pace, but at the same time, we're so overwhelmed with information? So how do we make sure that we are educating people in an efficient way and a trust-based way?
Rod, you want to start that one?
Sure. So I think the most important thing is that they recognizing that there is not a magic bullet. So that you're going to do this one strategy and everybody's going to get educated. I think there has to be multiple channels, multiple approaches, reaching out to multiple communities in different ways. So whether that is, so one of the things that's key for that is exposure earlier. So the ability to integrate programs in schools and community centers that allow young people, children access to technology and the opportunities to learn. There's and in Detroit, there's something called DAPSEP Detroit. It's an engineering program that's done with Ford Motor Company. Those kinds of opportunities where industry actually engages with young people, I think is vitally important. Number two, I would say, the education about the implications of the technologies and what they mean in terms of people's health. When I learned about, some of the cancer things happening in gene and cell therapy place as someone who lost their mother to cancer and who's a cancer survivor myself, there was a certain level of, oh, I understand how awful this is, right? And if I could be a part of the solution, why wouldn't I want to do that? And so I think the idea that there are multiple messages, multiple communities, but it has to be somewhat ubiquitous and very intentional.
It has to be intentional. It has to be focused on the audience, so you need to take the audience into consideration with the message. There's still a lot of communication that needs to be done, no doubt. But I think there are ways to get there. I think the big shotgun approach, trying to educate everybody at once, is not going to work. That kind of relate that back to scientific entrepreneurs, company founders that come to me and say, if the rest of the world just knew what I know, they'd be lined up at my door. We could say if the rest of the world just knew what I know, then we wouldn't have this problem. So we can't take that broad shotgun approach. It's got to be focused. The audience has to be considered with respect to the communication, and it has to be, as Rod said, very intentional.
Great, thank you. And then with 2 minutes to go, what would each of you leave as a closing comment when you think about the future of work in life sciences and biotech? And Rod, if you'd like to go first.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's dynamic and things are rapidly changing. And I think the biggest thing is that there's going to be a lot of innovation, and the markets that actually are intentional and working together to develop their ecosystem to provide that training are going to be the markets that win. And these approaches to workforce development have to be interdisciplinary. They have to allow on-ramps for different communities. And they've got to have a clear end in mind in terms of where the industry in that market is going, and be built around that.
Great, thank you. Marty?
And I would say, hang on, because it's going to be a wild ride. There is just so much happening. The innovation in life sciences right now, whether it's agricultural or healthcare, medicine, therapeutics, it's insane how rapidly it's developing. We have gene therapy companies that are editing the human genome to cure diseases like HIV that historically we've only been able to treat, not cure. And so the pace of change is going to be very dynamic. The opportunities are going to be massive. The more you can educate yourself, the more you can educate your family, your friends, your communities about what's happening, so that you can be a part of this innovation economy as it grows, the better for you. But it's going to be very rapidly moving and very dynamic.
Great, thank you very much. On behalf of Inquire AI, Marty, Rod, thank you for joining us today. Terrific, and thank you to our wonderful audience members for your questions. Really appreciate it, and look forward to the next discussion.
Great.